And appreciate thank you and welcome everyone to the Church Street UMW book review today. It is actually a book review. It lives up to its name. Last month we watched a documentary, and next month we're going to watch a fairly short documentary. It's about 30 minutes, called Perfect 36. It's the third Wednesday of May, and I'll need to double check that date. I don't have it right. I'm afraid if I get dyslexic, me may give you the wrong date. Let me double check. Third Wednesday, 1:30. Perfect 36. It's about a 30-minute documentary on passage of the 20th Amendment and Tennessee's role. It's excellent, and it's short. And I've been kind of reading and studying up on that when we were celebrating that anniversary last year. But it's very well done, and I think if you haven't seen it, I think you would enjoy it. And even if you've studied up on the 20th Amendment, it kind of really has a very specific Tennessee bent to it. So I've really enjoyed it. So I hope you will agree and approve of that selection as well. Today we are very fortunate to have the preeminent political science scholar from the University of Tennessee / my favorite political science professor and advisor, I might make mention, of 100 years ago, Dr. Pat Freeland. Thank you, Pat, so much for joining us. She always does a phenomenal job when she discusses whatever the topic at hand might be. We're lucky enough in the Lydia Circle that she's been a frequent teacher, and always is so well prepared and so knowledgeable and so educated on whatever subject she brings to light. So thank you so much, Pat, for sharing your time today, and I will turn it over to Pat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan. I wish all my students said those things about me all the time.
So it's 100% true.
Thank you very much. Well, the book I'm reading is Robert Ellenberg is the author, A Living Gospel, Reading God's Story in Holy Lives. And I will say that the cover I don't know who chose that cover, but it does not at all convey what the book is about. You look at the cover, that it's put out, and what it looks like, I don't know, it's a painting that would be from 1,000 years ago or so, and you get the sense that the book is about saints, and all these stories that you hear. But the book is actually the opposite of that. It's trying to say that it focuses on, for the most part, more recent people who were primarily involved in social justice issues. And the purpose of it is for us to get a different view of what makes a person a saint. The author is, and this is why I got interested in it, does the name Ellsberg ring a bell for anybody? Daniel Ellsberg? Yeah. Daniel Ellsberg, you'll remember, was a defense. He worked for the Department of Defense, and he took papers that detailed about the Vietnam War. He copied them and released them to the media. He narrowly escaped a long prison term. And this is his son, Robert Ellenberg, who wrote the book. So he comes from a history of social activism. He said when he was 13 years old, he remembered his father. There are thousands and thousands of pages that his father gave both him and his sister pages to copy. So that's what he did before they were released to the media. So Robert Ellenberg, he was raised Episcopalian. He lived with his mother. His parents were divorced. He went to Harvard when he was a sophomore, decided it wasn't for him, that he wanted to get more, as he put it, more involved with life. So he left Harvard, and two experiences really affected him. One, he got work as a young man in a hospice, and he talks about that having a very important influence on his life, to watch how people served these patients at their end of their life. The other thing is that he started working with Dorothy Day, who he was an author about her contribution to the Catholic worker movement. So he became very involved in social issues through the Catholic Church that led him to eventually become a Catholic. And he has focused his work on writing about saints. And there's a term for that, which I had never heard it before. Let me see if I can find it here. I don't see it. Anyway, I'll run across it. And I never heard the term before, but it's a person who writes about the saints. So he's written other books, and he's a pretty well-known Catholic writer. So let me, the term is hagiography. Anybody? I'm probably mispronouncing. Anybody heard that term before?
Mm-mm.
So let me begin the question. How many saints can we name? Let's hear. How many people do you know are? There's a few obvious ones, but I couldn't name any. What's the first name that comes to mind?
Well,
Saint Christopher.
Okay, yeah, Saint Christopher.
St. Francis of Assisi.
All right, yeah, there's two.
Saint Michael, I think, is the patron of like the armed services and policemen and
Yeah, okay.
Saint Cecilia, she's the patron saint of music. And the reason I know that is I was raised Catholic by a great aunt until I turned 12 and a half. So I went to Catholic school and I chose her for my confirmation name because she was a patron saint of music.
Okay, Danny, you probably learned quite a few
Mhm.
saints' names in Catholic school.
I know a Cecilia who I know a Celia who I think is a saint. Aren't you all?
Exactly. Now,
Um,
Pat, I went to a Catholic, well, it wasn't a Catholic wedding because it was at Church Street last summer, but it was partly a Catholic service, and there was a like 20-minute singing list of all these people's names I had never heard of personally, but it was quite lengthy.
yeah, there's quite a few. I mean, the first one that comes to my mind is Joan of Arc. So, I mean, we can identify some saints named St. Jude and so forth. What comes to mind when you think of the word saint? What kind of person is canonized? What does it take to become a saint?
Sacrificial,
Like Mother Teresa, yeah.
Yeah,
it's somebody with verified, who does miracles. I mean, who's performed a miracle.
yeah. The
Think.
Catholic,
Mhm.
go ahead, Nancy. The Catholic Church has put in place a specific series of, they do an investigation and you have to show that there was miracles. And interestingly, they put that in place because there were so many kind of crazy stories. They wanted to get some control over who was named a saint. And you'll see stuff, a hamburger that takes on the shape of Jesus, or something like that. And it was especially common, when they say, well, some river heals people and things like that. But really, the Catholic Church has tried to get around that image of the perfect person. And people will say, I'm no Mother Teresa, for example. And the focus of this book really is to talk about these people as being ordinary people with faults, just like the rest of us. To become a saint, and the Pope recently has said that, is they are not perfect person. It doesn't mean that their theology is always what we accept, but they are people who show love in their life. And that's the focus of this book. And let me read you one of the reviews that I thought. The saints are not unreachable, perfect people floating in prayer, but real human beings who live close to the ground, who sought to follow Jesus despite their flaws, their crappy moods, There are moments of doubt and disbelief. In other words, there are people just like us. So that's the book. And he focuses on 5 particular people. And I'm so happy I read the book, because I could probably give you a 1-sentence description of all 5 of these people, or maybe not even that. But I really didn't know anything about them. And he describes their lives. The 5 people are Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, and you're probably familiar, Henry Nouwen, Flannery O'Connor, and I hope there's an English major in this group, and Charles, and I may not even be pronouncing these names correctly, Falcott. And of these 5, Falcott will likely become a saint. It is in the process now, but the other 4 will not, for various reasons that we'll get into. I mean, I can't imagine that the Catholic Church would canonize them, but when you hear about their lives and what they contributed, you really see that they tried to follow Jesus, and their focus was they had flawed lives, but they went through them and they contributed to others. And I'm going to talk about these 5 people, but I want to begin with, if you read nothing else in the book, he has a section on women in sainthood, which I thought was very good, and maybe that'll be his next book. But he says that there are relatively few women who become saints, and he says, and the reason is probably because it's men who control who become saints. And for the most part, the women who become saints, they are people that he calls it they exhibit traditional conceptions of feminism. Okay? And that means they were obedient, they were quiet, and above all, they were, anybody want to put in that last word? They were virgins. So the Catholic churches love to select women who, he talks about some of these, when they become saints, it appears, because they did little more than, and I don't want to, well, I'll explain this. They did little more than fight off somebody who tried to rape them. And of course, we should applaud that they were able to do that. They showed agency and so forth, but the focus hasn't tended to be how they took control of their lives and fought off these attacks. The focus has been on, they kept themselves pure. So there's a group of women who are termed the virgin martyrs because that was their main interest. So there's some discussion about that, as a church put virginity above all, and there's a discussion on that. But his central point in discussing these virgin martyrs is that other women, and some became saints and some did not, but they did not fit this description of what was thought of as being a woman. Instead, they accomplished a lot and they defied church authorities. In fact, some of the women who later became saints were excommunicated for a while because they made their male superiors uncomfortable. The bishops would they would start a mission someplace. The men would decide that they were getting too uppity or something, and they refused to comply. So they would be shut off, and most of the time they just kept going on in their own. So it's a very interesting discussion of women who did what they felt called to do. And you might recognize some of these names. Saint Teresa, and I'm going to mispronounce these names, so jump in here when I do. Avila, Saint Catherine of Siena, Saint Hildegard of Bingen, and Saint Joan of Arc. They were viewed at the time as horrible troublemakers. And people just wanted to get rid of him. So if you read nothing else on the book, take a look at his description of these very strong women who defied authority at the time and accomplished a great deal in their mission work. So let me stop and say, any questions, or do you know any of the stories of these women, either the Virgin Martyrs? And I don't mean to make fun of them. Most of the stories are unbelievably horrible. I mean, awful. But his point is that the Catholic Church is focused a great deal more on women who fit these traditional models rather than women who were, you know, kind of out there for their time.
Pat,
Yeah,
I've been reading lately some about Julian of Norwich. Is she a saint?
I did not see her name. Now, that doesn't mean that she's not.
She was probably had too much agency of her own to be named a saint. I don't know. But she's quite a fascinating. She, I think, was a contemporary maybe of Hildegard of Bingen, or at least she's in that category with her.
What did she do?
Oh, she had visions. She wrote numerous, like a diary that then was, I think it was in the 1500s, maybe the 15th century. I'm not sure. But she saw and reported miracles and things that were out of everybody's ordinary experience, but all very much focused on loving God and having this these ecstatic kind of experiences with God.
Okay, that sounds very interesting.
She is.
And some people considered her crazy.
Yeah.
And her her only companion was a cat.
I can get that. Anybody else? Are you familiar with the term Virgin Martyrs? Well, let's move on then, and let me talk about Dorothy Day. What do you know about her? What is she best known for? Does it ring a bell? I bet you're like me, you kind of, yeah, I do.
I read a book about her, and I can't, it's been long enough, I can't remember. I mean, she was a Catholic social worker, but she really, I mean, she did a huge amount. Right now I'm sort of blank about what she did, but she was such an activist.
And she's a very interesting woman. Anybody else recall
Yes.
anything about her? Well, she was born 1897 and died 1980. And she did not grow up in a particular religious home. But she went to Chicago and then ended up moving to New York City. And in New York City, she became very involved with, think of the time here, this was socialist and communist movements. So she became a social activist. She, her friends were, many of them were well-known authors, artists in the city. She was involved in protests. She went to Virginia for a protest for the women's vote. She was arrested and thrown in prison. So she had a lot of interest early on in social activism. She had an abortion during that time. And then she was in a common law relationship he was a socialist atheist who did not believe in marriage. So she was in this relationship, And she did not think she could be pregnant but she did get pregnant. So after she had her child, it's interesting to read kind of the things that happened. She got more, she started to think that she wanted to have the child baptized. She saw this Catholic nun on the street, and who, and started to talk to her, and it turned her more towards the Catholic Church. She eventually, she turned more and more to Catholicism, and it cost her a lot, really, in terms of personal life, because her common law husband, of course, this would not be allowed in the Catholic Church. He was an anarchist, and he would not marry her. The Catholic Church would not accept her unless she was married. So they split up. He remained part of her life. They remained friends. But from that point on, she became more and more of a serious Catholic. So she tried to, again, she had her baby, and she tried to help the poor. She didn't know quite to do. And she went, if you've ever been to Catholic University, and she went to the shrine there and prayed about what to do to help the poor. She came home. It sounds like a crazy story, but this French Catholic activist was sitting in her apartment and said, "We need to start a magazine." And they started the Catholic Workers Movement and started a magazine. Okay, and it quickly, in this, we got to think about what 100,000 subscriptions would be back then. It was a very liberal magazine. There are a lot of socialists involved in it, but times were rough. This was during the Depression. It quickly picked up interest, and then from there, the newspaper, they started the hospitality houses, which provided housing for large numbers of people. And her mission, she said, was nobody would be turned around or would be turned away. She was mad at the Catholic Church, she said, for not doing more to help. The statistics are unreal. The percentage of people who were without housing at the time. She, as I said, refused to turn anybody away. And she explains her gospel inspiration for this housing. The mystery of the poor is this, that they are Jesus, and what you do for them, you do for him. It is the only way of knowing and believing in our love. The Social Catholic Workers Movement served the poor in more than 200 communities. And they had it'd be weird today, what their political agenda was. They took stands against racial segregation, nuclear warfare, the draft, and armed conflict around the world. And she got a lot of grief because she was opposed to the US entering World War II. On the other hand, she was against the welfare state. She thought it was the church's job to do these things. And she argued strongly against Social Security or any other type of government welfare. She, many people found her, she was just this, unusual mixture of opinions. She was traditionally Catholic in many areas. She told young people what she expected of them in terms of sexual activity. She strongly opposed abortion. So she was a traditional Catholic in many ways, while pushing kind of a more liberal agenda in other areas. Again, as she got older, many of the younger people considered her her views against birth control, abortion, and so forth, sex outside of marriage, as absurd. So that's Dorothy Day. She had become, and she's viewed as one of the most prominent thinkers on the left. And there is talk of making her a saint, but do you see that happening? No, no, not a woman who had an abortion and so forth. So what do you know about her? What do you think about her life?
Hey, Pat,
Yeah.
I just realized as you were talking about the Catholic worker, look what I've got.
Oh, great.
This is the March-April edition of this year. We started receiving this about 6 months ago, and I just don't know who sent it to us. And then I finally figured out it was a new friend who wanted us to see it. But anyway, the major article is on Dorothy Day and anti-Semitism. That's the title of the article.
Oh.
And across from it is an excerpt from a Martin Luther King speech, the Sunday sermon given at the National Cathedral, March 31st, 1968, called Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution. So it's got lots of interesting things. It's really tiny print and pretty deep articles. So I don't read it all every time, but it's pretty interesting.
I mean, there were many intellectuals connected with it, so that doesn't surprise me that it's continued as kind of an intellectual movement while being involved in social activism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they said in terms of making her a saint, conservatives are horrified making anybody a saint who had an abortion, and liberals say, no, she wouldn't have wanted that. She doesn't care about that kind of attention. Anybody else know anything about Dorothy Day? Okay, let's move on to Thomas Merton. And Pat, I think you know something about him, don't you?
Pat Bellingrath.
Yeah.
Am I the only other Pat here? Dang it.
Yeah.
I love Thomas Merton. I have to say, I love Thomas Merton. He wrote several books. I went to the Abbey at Gethsemane. I'm saying it right? Gethsemane in Kentucky, right before the pandemic started. That's where he's buried. And he was there for a while. And I read a good bit about his life then. Of course, I don't remember. He was fairly young, I think in his 50s when he died.
Mm-hmm.
But his whole life too, which was so fascinating for me, it was such an evolution of where he started, you know, when he was young, and then where he was when he died. And so he chronicles that in all his writing, his own journey. And it is just, it's fascinating to me. I love his writing, and his grave at Gethsemane is about this big. It's teeny tiny with like a little handmade plaque on it. It's nothing grand, just very humble and almost insignificant. But I was glad to see it. But anyway, I'm a big fan of Thomas Merton.
Yeah, I knew that you had been there, and it's silence, right? Is that there's only certain places that.
Yes, and me, the introvert, loved it. You cannot talk. It's, yeah, complete silence. It was wonderful. Nobody could talk to me, and I couldn't talk to anybody.
Well,
And his autobiography, The 7-Story Mountain, is fascinating.
Yes, it is. That's a great one.
And that's a name I think most of us could say 2 sentences, maybe. You know, we know he's a well-known, respected author, but we don't know that much about his life. So he was born in 1915, and his mother died when he was 6, which probably affected his life. His father then traveled frequently, and so he moved around to quite a few different places. And as Pat said, he lived kind of a wild young adult life. He enrolled in University, Cambridge, and it did not go well. He drank all the time, partied, bumming around, and he fathered a child outside of marriage, a child that he never met. So things were not going well in his life. His father had died, and he says part of his, drinking, excessive drinking, was a result of his father's death. But he had a guardian who decided, enough of this, I'm spending too much time. So I pulled him out and he pulled him out of England and sent him to Columbia University in New York City. So that's where he started. And so he kind of stumbled around there. And his path to the priesthood was actually through Columbia and New York City. He started to read books on spirituality, and he started to embrace Catholicism. Well, New York, and there's various Catholic churches he would go to, and it didn't ever appear at that point that he would ever become a priest. First of all, he liked women too much, and he was involved heavily in leftist demonstrations when he was there. He'd become a university professor or a poet, or something like that. But he became interested in Eastern religions. And he contacted somebody who is a well-known author on Eastern mysticism, and said, what should I do now? This is my interest. And he came back to him. Maybe he looked at his life and thought, I don't want to deal with you, But anyway, this Eastern mysticism person told him to read more in the Christian tradition. So he's okay, so I'm not going to enter Eastern mysticism. I'll read more in Christianity. So from there, he started reading more and started to think more about becoming a Catholic priest. But then again, his friends are saying, what? So what kind of priest should he become? He wasn't sure. And you won't believe how he picked to become a monk and go to Kentucky. Okay, there is, and I'm not going to pronounce this right, there's some ancient ritual called Sorte Sanctorum. Catherine might know what that is. I've never heard of that. But what it is, and you may have relatives who might have done this. I thought this was only done by, people who weren't sure what they were doing. But he opened the Bible at random, put his finger on a place in the Bible to decide what he should do with his life. And he saw Luke 1:20, behold, you shall be silent. So that took him to Kentucky, where he became a monk and took the vow of silence. Pat, were you familiar with that story?
Yes, I'd forgotten about that.
Yeah.
But I wasn't until I read it, just a year and a half ago.
I didn't think anybody really did that very much, but okay. So that's how he ended up there. And in many ways, it was not a very good fit, because the monks worked together. They made cheese. They made different kinds of food items to be self-supporting. Well, he was an author, and that's what he spent most of his time doing. So he felt guilty. He felt like other people were looking at him because he wasn't contributing as much as others to the physical labor to keep it going. On the other hand, as Pat pointed out, his superiors were more than happy to have him write, because he wrote this bestseller, an autobiography of how, he decided to become a monk in the 7-story mountain. I haven't read it, but they said many people became monks and entered the priesthood after that book came out. So, he would say, well, I can, move away from my writing a bit. And they weren't getting the profits from these books. Say, no, you keep writing. So he kept writing. He decided at one point that he wanted more social activism. He tried to move to Mexico and begin down there. His superiors said no, they would not allow him to do that. So he stayed on for a while on, but he became quite more and more unhappy. At the age of 50, he was allowed to become a hermit, meaning they gave him a place there where he lived by himself. Okay. He had back trouble. So this leads to something else. So although he was a hermit, he had some health problems and he entered a hospital. Two ramifications from this. One, he became more aware of what was going on in the world, you know, the racial injustice movements, Vietnam War protests. That was point number one. Second thing is he met a young nurse and they had an affair. So he had to make a decision about whether he would remain as a monk or whether he would leave. He ultimately decided that he would remain a monk. So that was the end of the affair. And but he became more and more aware that he wanted to become involved in social justice issues. So he wrote much of his writing then turned more and more to those types of issues. And he's written over 60 publications. So he wanted to travel. I mean, here you have this man who is, you know, he was widely traveled, widely viewed as an intellectual, and his superiors were pretty much telling him, you know, you're a hermit, stay there as a hermit, keep writing to make us money. Finally, he got a new superior who allowed him to travel, and he went to meet up. He was rekindling his interest in Eastern mysticism, and he was going to meet some people, some well-known authors there. He wanted some more insight into Buddhism. He was writing a book on the Desert Fathers, and in Bangkok, he was going, you know, staying there. He stepped out of the shower, slipped on the floor, and grabbed an electric fan and electrocuted himself. So he's about 58 or 60, I can't remember. So he was a relatively young man when he died. Now, they didn't do an autopsy. There continued to be speculation, although I don't think most people believe it was an accident. Some people say the CIA silenced him because he was such a critic of the Vietnam War. Other people suggest it was a suicide because he wasn't, you know, a man with, you know, contradictions in his life that, you know, I don't think there's much evidence for either one of those. So that's Thomas Merton, a fascinating life, right? A person who probably would not be canonized either, but has had an enormous impact on people.
Wasn't there some controversy about whether he was murdered? Like, I can't remember.
Yeah, there is some people who think he was murdered, and it was a CIA.
Yeah.
Yes, because of his anti-Vietnam writings.
Okay, I couldn't remember why. I just remembered there was some controversy.
Okay, that's Thomas Merton. And Flannery O'Connor. All right, who wants to talk? Flannery O'Connor was born in 1925 in Georgia. She died at the age of 39 of lupus. Of course, back then there wasn't the health care that there is now for people with lupus. She knew what was in store for her because her father had died young of lupus. And she is best known for her short stories. Anybody want to take a stab on explaining?
Well, I just remember she was a devout Catholic, and you know, I remember too reading after I studied her. I was an English major and I don't remember much from those days, but I do remember afterwards, you know, and we didn't talk about it much when I was studying some of her works in college, but later, you know, there was a lot of reflection and comment on her books. There were 2 novels that, and her short story collections, so there was a lot of racist
Mhm.
undertones and even overtones in them. And I think just maybe in 2020 on the Loyola campus, there was a dorm that was named for her, and they renamed it for this woman that I think is wonderful. She was a Catholic sister. Her name is Theresa Bowman, I think's her name. And she was an activist, and she's also was African-American. And I know they renamed that dorm on the Loyola campus for her because of her racist writings. That's kind of basically what I remember about her.
Yeah, she was a very serious Catholic, and her books, it's mostly short stories that she writes. And I mean, I could see that as the 2 main facets of her life. She was concerned, her characters are grotesque. It's usually a murder or several murders. These, she liked to make fun of Protestants in various ways. But she focused on, her point was, she said, she has violence and grotesque characters because she wants to focus on that sudden death or seeing death gives people the opportunity for grace. And that's where her focus was. Our people, everybody is offered the opportunity of grace. And you'd have to have, most of us would need Cliff Notes or, you know, something like that, an English teacher to explain this in her stories, because they are weird. Okay, let me read. She writes Tennessee enters into many of her stories if they focus on the South. This talks about a preacher who comes home. He's had a horrible experience in war. So his family is all very religious, and he's sick of it all, and he starts what he calls an anti-church, the church without Christ. So this preacher, this church, he says, I'm a member and preacher to the church where the blind don't see and the lame don't walk, in what's dead stays that way. Ask me about that church and I'll tell you it's the church that the blood of Jesus don't fall with redemption. Okay. Another short story, it's this horrible family. Most of these stories are these horrible, you know, characters. 2 people, it's a grandmother, and they're going to go on a vacation or drive someplace. Without it take me too long to describe the plot and everything, but one horrible little boy's name is John Wesley. And you know, this person called the misfit is an escaped convict. Actually, he knows what he doesn't believe in Christianity or religion. He's very upfront about it. Doesn't believe it. He said, and I enjoy being mean. That's what I'm going to do. Where the grandmother, on the other hand, considered herself a Christian, but she, when it came down to it, didn't really believe anything. She didn't treat people well. And kind of the end of it is they both show some humanity at the end. So those are the kind of stories that she tells. People have the opportunity for grace. Are they going to take it or not is kind of it. She says this about the South, mostly Protestant. The religion of the South is a do-it-yourself religion, which I, as a Catholic, find painful and comic. There's nothing to correct their practical heresies, and so they work them out dramatically. So, strict Catholic, handled her death well. Now, what Pat said is right. I mean, there was starting to be an interest in her work again, but there is no question that she was racist. On one hand, some of her works were very understanding, and she was critical of the prejudice against Black people. Some of her works, you can find that. But on the other hand, she was, she reflected, she went, Pat, you might have read some of her writings when she went to New York City and Boston, and her writings about all the Black people she saw there. And it was clearly upsetting to her that the places she saw, which were more racially integrated than she was used to in the South. So if there is ever interest in her canonization, racism will end that. Anybody else? Well, we're coming to an end of our time, so let me go through Nouwen. Henry Nouwen is, he's a very interesting, born 1932, died in 1996. And he, unlike our other characters, it did not live a wild young adult life. He always knew he wanted to be a priest. He was always interested in religion and spirituality. He's best known because of his writings. He taught at prominent universities, and scholars say that his writings appealed to even atheists because he wrote about spirituality. Although he was a Catholic priest and followed the priesthood, he connected people to the idea of spirituality. And I hadn't really thought about this, but they say people didn't talk about spirituality as opposed to religion until the 1970s. And it's largely because of his writings that people started to think about the idea that you could be spiritual, but not religious. So that is probably his primary, contribution to life. In addition to that, like some of the other people we talked to, he became very active in social justice movements, including the Vietnam War. He had, he was at the Menninger Clinic in terms of his idea, his focus was on spirituality and psychology. He trained at the Menninger Clinic. He continued to write about mental health, spirituality, but he was plagued by serious depression, and it incapacitated him at some points. Most people believe that it was because he was gay. He talked to people about it. He considered including that in one of his books. He decided not to, some people say, because he did not want to be known as the gay priest. So although he was pretty open about it, he stuck with his celibacy vows, but he was pretty open about it. And it probably, certainly heavily contributed to his depression at the time. We're talking about 50s, 60s. He wrote about the need for interpersonal connection. He frequently wrote about his loneliness. His most famous work on the topic is The Inner Voice of Love. And you might also be familiar with his book, The Return of the Prodigal Son, describing love and forgiveness as unconditional. He became interested in helping those with severe disabilities. He worked in a couple places, and he was somewhat surprised when he got called to work in home, and he thought he would be doing, like pastoral counseling, but no, they gave him a young man to take care of named Adam, and he did his physical care. So here you have this very well-known author who spent his days, bathing and feeding somebody who could not function. But he attributes that greatly contributed to his spirituality. And he wrote about the severely disabled in his book, Adam, God's Beloved, and how that contributed, how he came to understand greatly how God loves everybody. So that's Henry Now, and again, that's probably another name that you are familiar with. You may not know all his work, but finally, the last person I'll say mention is Foucault. And again, I'm probably mispronouncing it, a spoiled aristocrat who became a happy hermit in the Sahara, where he was martyred. Okay, he pretty much lived by himself there as a priest. And he tried to start several congregations there, wasn't very successful out in the desert there. And he was killed, some soldiers came in, and but his writings led to the founding of the Little Brothers of Jesus among religious congregations. And he is on his way to canonization. I mean, this has everything right. Although he lived a wild life, he didn't have a child outside marriage or anything like that. And he was clearly martyred in the sense that somebody came in and killed him while he was working. So he's on his way. So that's the last I've got to say of the people. Any thoughts on any of these authors? Or I bet some of you have read some of these works.
I think Henry Now, go ahead.
I just had a question. I've heard of everyone you've talked about and remember, from the past, like, oh, I need to go read up. But I've heard of Little Brothers of Jesus, but say the man's name again. How do you spell his last name?
Okay, Charles, and then I'm not sure how to pronounce it. And there's a D-E, and I don't know if that's a middle name. I'm showing my ignorance here. And then Foucauld.
Oh, okay.
He died in 1916, so he's one of the earlier ones.
Okay, thank you.
Thinking about now, and I thought quite a bit about, if he had written, he died in 1996, and, he would it have made a difference if he had written about being gay at the time, his same-sex attractions? So he was very well known, in terms of spirituality. But, this article I read about him was comparing his decision not to Anderson Cooper, who was criticized for not coming out. And his answer to that was, I don't want to be known as the gay newscaster. He didn't want to be labeled that way. So kind of similar reasoning. But now it is very well known also. So I'm done, except for kind of the conclusion, and then we don't have much time for comments. And I didn't know how to have more discussion here, but in the conclusion that the author wants us to take from this is that holiness consists of doing God's will. And that might sound sentimental and vague, but for people, doing God's will is practical and concrete. Few of us are called to do great things, but our responses to everyday situations are just as important. Smiling regardless of mood, paying attention to the lonely person who is boring, we'd rather talk to somebody else. Each act of love matters, and we are not to forget the lesson of what Jesus can do with acts of love, thinking about the multiplication of bread and fish. So that's what he wants us to take away from these stories. And I just found it fascinating how these people, we tend to think of Mother Teresa types, and that's not the lives of these people.
Pat, you did a great job. It's amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Pat, this is Verna. You did a great job. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Pat, out of curiosity, did it make you want to read any of these folks' writings?
Yes, because I've read excerpts from Nowen and Merton and these different people, but I didn't have any context at all,
I didn't. All right.
I think Nowen's best known work is The Wounded Healer, which is really a classic, and a lot of people have probably read that.
Mhm, mhm.
You think about this professor at Yale and, who's writing 60 things, and he spent the last of his days, bathing people and feeding them and so forth.
Fascinating.
I subscribe to a little daily devotion from the Henry Nouwen Society. It is so good. It's just a brief little thing that talks about love a lot, your inner stillness. I mean, every day it's just a good little focus that, to read. And I get one of those. I think it's 5 or 7 days a week. I don't know. But anyway, it's very good. I think this year is the 25th anniversary of his death. And so.
Oh, really?
Oh. Fascinating. Fascinating.
Well, I had not heard of the book, and so I looked at, that you reviewed today or gave a summary for it. And you're right. If I had just seen the cover of the book, I thought, because I was like, oh, Pat Freeland's giving a book review, it'll be great, regardless of what it is. I want to hear Pat. And it's like, oh.
No.
I'll admit it. I thought, oh, this is going to be about all those old saints. But this was fascinating, and I'm reminded, and you would have done a great job if it were about the old saints, but I'm reminded that in the New Testament, in Paul's letters, he always was writing to the saints. It was just any follower of Jesus, and usually he was reminding them of what they weren't doing. So they weren't perfect, but we say we're all saints because we're followers of Jesus. So a work in progress. But no, this was great, and I love Flannery O'Connor, so I appreciated her being in that list. And I'm finally going to read 7 Story Mountain. It's on my shelf. I've had it for years. I'm going to read it today.
I mean, I find it highly comforting that these people were so flawed, really.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
I mean, they weren't flawed, they were human. And that's a wrong word. They were human.
Exactly. Well, Pat, thank you so much. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to share or comment on? Excellent, excellent, excellent job as always.
Good job, Pat.
As always, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Many
Pat.
thanks to you, Pat. And our next, I did look it up, the third Wednesday of May will be May 19th, 1:30. Again, we'll be reviewing about a 30-minute documentary on the passing of the women's voting right amendment in 1920, and it's focused on Tennessee's role in that, about a 30-minute documentary called The Perfect 36, May 19th. Again, many thanks to Pat, many thanks to everybody for joining us today. If you would be so kind, I'm going to close us in prayer. Again, thanks for being here. Father, we thank you that you have revealed your love for us today. We invite you to send us out from here in the power of the Holy Spirit, doing God's will, remembering that each act of love matters. Come reveal your grace and truth to us each day, for yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Thanks, everybody. Anybody else have anything else they'd like to make mention?
I want to ask you to remember in prayer Mary Ann Gibson, who broke her femur.
Oh,
Thank you.
She's had so
Did-
much.
didn't she
Yes.
break something in a few years ago?
Several
Okay.
years ago, I think she had hip replacements.
Plus
And
she
I
broke her
think
leg.
maybe it was from a breakdown. I'm not sure. Somebody else probably knows well.
She also broke her leg, I think, pretty soon.
That's what I'm thinking of.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
She fell and broke it, I think.
Yeah, she is at Well Park. She was had surgery on Friday, and I guess it's good. It was a good break because they put the rod in, and it's where she can immediately put weight on it, so you don't have to wait for physical therapy. So she can begin physical therapy, and I don't think she tripped on exercise equipment. So she was exercising. It wasn't that she was, maybe I should have shared that, but Barna shared it.
Yeah.
Let's not share that. But I always, we always think of people like, oh, they fell, so don't exercise.
I was going to ask if